And for more on commitments made at COP30, we turn now to our next guest, Michael Shank, in his Adjunct Professor of Sustainable Development at New York University. He joins us now from Virginia. Michael, so much for taking the time for joining us. Let me start by just asking you about some of the key achievements you think were achieved at COP30.
One could argue that not a lot was achieved, including the lowest government turnout in the last 10 years of climate talks since the Paris climate talks 10 years ago, and we are celebrating the 10th anniversary of that. So lowest government turnout. I will say that the EU really stepped up. They're already hitting 50% emissions reduction. That was a goal for 2030, but they're already there now. They plan to be at 90% reduction by 2040 on their way to net zero by 2050. So that's exemplary leadership in and around COP30 in Brazil. China also committing to some emissions reduction. But there was a new report out today by the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit on the 10th anniversary of the Paris climate talks that showed that we have decoupled economic growth from emissions growth, which is phenomenal. We've long saw it and seen it, but now majority of countries, 90 plus countries, 90% of the world's population now is seeing economic growth decoupled from emissions growth. What does that mean? China, as an example, in the last 10 years, saw 50% economic growth, but only 24, 25% emissions growth. So now we can see growth economically without the corresponding emissions growth. So there is some good news coming out this month, but in and around the climate talks in Brazil, we're not seeing the kind of leadership at the national level that we ultimately need to see globally.
And to that point, at the end of COP30, UN Secretary Antonio Guterres posted on X saying, quote, important results were obtained, but it's difficult to reach a consensus in a period of deep geopolitical divide. So evidently, we cannot pretend that COP has delivered everything that is needed. What are some of the opportunities that were missed in Brazil, do you think?
Yeah, so we see a real leadership vacuum among nation states in this climate talk space. And so what they missed in Brazil is perhaps a rethink on the next 10 years of talks and who should we really center in these talks. Maybe it's not nation states because we're not seeing the kind of leadership we need to see. And again, historic low turnout by government officials, including the United States, where only Senator Sheldon Whitehouse was there representing the US government, not in the talks officially, but there as the only sole government representative from Washington, D.C., which is pretty remarkable. And so could we see a different kind of conferencing in the future? Perhaps a conference of a different kind of COP, perhaps a conference of the philanthropists or a conference of the photovoltaic private investors, given that solar electricity is now the cheapest in history and renewables have seen double the investment than fossil fuels have this year. So renewables are seeing twice the investment the fossil fuels. So maybe a conference of the photovoltaic private investors, or perhaps a conference of the prevention security types, given the obsession with immigration and migration into Europe, into North America. Climate change will only worsen those trends, and so maybe we should conference on that. Or a conference of the partners. So these are all COPs of different natures because cities, states, regions, tribes are really where the leadership is happening. It's not at the nation state level. It's among local governments. It's among states, regions, tribes, indigenous peoples. They are the real leaders right now. And so perhaps a different kind of conferencing for the next 10 years is needed.
And Michael, every 5 years, nearly all of the Paris climate signatories, they have to submit these NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. So far, just 121 have come back with those commitments per Climate Watch. How encouraging or not is that?
Well, I'm a professor, so anytime a student turns in their paper late, it's disappointing. And a lot of these NDCs were turned in late and they were poorly written with not so ambitious goals, targets, and timelines. So again, going back to where we're seeing leadership, of course, China's leading outside the NDC in pretty remarkable ways, being the global dominant solar, wind, battery, electric vehicle, heat pump manufacturer and producer. So there's leadership in other areas where, again, these NDCs may fall short. EU, as I mentioned earlier, is leading in the NDC space because already they've met 50% reduction by 2030. And again, they're ratcheting that up to 90% by 2040 and then net zero by 2050. But I think it's worth the climate community reconsidering where we're putting all our eggs. We're putting a lot of eggs in the nation state basket, and perhaps we need to rethink the next 10 years. I was there in Paris at the climate talks 10 years ago, and I helped mayors not only attend the climate talks in Paris, but also meet with the Pope that year in the run-up to the Paris talks. A lot of phenomenal leadership. But now we're seeing threats 10 years later, far-right governments tacking further right and letting go of their climate commitments. And so local governments, states, regions, tribes, that's where the real leadership is happening, and in the markets, like I already mentioned, with China dominating global markets in the renewable space.
And as we see this sort of political polarization that sets in, and different countries, different leaders have different agendas, how do leaders start to rebuild trust in climate policy, and how do we engage more of the citizenry in that?
That's a great question. So the climate talks have usually been about, what are we against? We're against climate change. Well, it's hard to rally the publics in something they're against. It's a little easier to rally them in something that we're for. What are we for? We're for more affordability. That's a tongue twister. We're for more affordability. We're for better lives, more enjoyable homes, commutes, heating, cooling, and all of that is possible in the green transition, but we're spending a lot of time pitching what we're against in these climate talks and not what we're for. So I think the more we can center the stories at the local level, where trust is usually higher, around what we're for with real people, real needs, real solutions, the better. Certainly with these floods and fires and droughts that we're seeing in South Asia, Southeast Asia, all the way over to Seattle, Washington State is seeing a lot of floods. These are real people with real needs being impacted in real time by climate disasters. And so pivoting off that awareness, which is usually higher during a climate disaster, to lock in the need for a transition and how our lives will be better. Again, what we're for needs to be messaged loudly and clearly.
Michael, where are we in the climate fight right now? Are we winning and losing? And what are some of the targets you think we need to meet in 2026?
Yeah, so I think we're losing at the global scale when it comes to nation states in these climate talks. Again, historic low turnout by government officials. And in the last 10 years of climate talks, which I usually attend, I've seen waning interest and a lackluster goal setting by nation states. Where we are winning is at the local level. Cities really leading globally in this space, and where I've been consulting over the last 10 years is in this space, though they're seeing attacks too. Some cities like Vancouver, BC is considering letting go of its climate and sustainability department entirely as it makes an effort to cut taxes and cut expenditures at the city level. So it doesn't mean that cities are seeing attacks. They are, and a lot of cities are seeing defunded sustainability departments, defunded climate departments. So the opportunity in 2026, and where I've coached and consulted cities before, is how to embed and bury this work in other departments. And it naturally fits in housing. It naturally fits in a health department. It naturally fits in an Office of Economic Development. All of the things in making our lives better to counter climate change can fit in any of those departments and then is less likely to be attacked. I'm seeing cities and counties bury this work and embed this work in neighborhoods. How do we make our neighborhoods more livable? So there's a lot of opportunity in positioning what we're for. It's going to take some creativity, because what has worked in the last 10 years probably won't work as well in terms of messaging, framing, NDCs, and more in the next 10 years. So a pivot is needed.
All right, creative approaches, definitely. All right, thank you so much, Michael Shank, for your insight. We will leave it there.
Thanks, Karina.
And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Karina Mitchell in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.